When you think about ADHD, a lot of things come to mind, and for good reason. Over the past decade, the internet has become saturated with videos, posts, and articles left and right about the daily struggles of living with ADHD. It almost feels endemic to the world we live in. But why is that? Well, today we're going to be discovering what ADHD is, where it comes from, why it's so common in our society, and perhaps the most controversial question for this topic: can we fix this ADHD epidemic? We're going to talk about all that and more on today's episode of Mind Map. Back in 1798, there was a doctor named Alexander Crichton who noticed that some people were very easily distracted and they weren't able to focus on activity in the same way as other people in their peer group. It was at that time he labeled these children as intellectually disabled. Ergo, they were unable to learn at the same rate as neurotypical children. This perspective was adopted by schools and religious institutions across the UK for the next century. Now let's fast forward to 1902, and there was a British pediatrician named Sir George Frederick who described ADHD as, quote, an abnormal defect of moral control in children, end quote. He believed that while children were completely unable to control their behavior in the way a typical child would, they were still intelligent to some degree. Now, fast forward again to 1932, and a pharmaceutical manufacturer named Smith, Kline and French developed a product called Benzedrine. A lot of you may have heard of this. 4 years later, a doctor by the name of Charles Bradley stumbled across some unexpected but pretty positive side effects of the drug, noting that young patients' behavior and performance really seemed to improve when they were under the effects of the drug. Now, his friends and contemporaries didn't really much care for this finding. While it was an interesting discovery, it was also very novel. And unfortunately for Dr. Bradley, novelty was viewed as the science of quacks and madmen, which is arguably the most important reason that pharmaceutical research and development has, historically speaking, been so slow to be adopted. Now, for reference, it took the entire global population of scientific engineers and researchers nearly 3 decades to come together and create a vaccine for the flu, and there are still people who refuse to get vaccinated. So there's that. It's safe to say that this is likely one of the drivers for why Benzedrine was not widely accepted by the large body of science in the 1930s. It took another 32 years for the DSM to include what they call, quote, hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, end quote, for the first time. In 1980, the APA, or the American Psychological Association, released the 3rd edition of the DSM and changed the name of the disorder from hyperkinetic reaction of childhood to attention deficit disorder, what we now know as ADD. Now, at that time, scientists believed that hyperactivity was not a common symptom of the disorder, so they decided to break it up into 2 subtypes. There was ADD with hyperactivity and ADD without hyperactivity. 7 years later, they removed the distinction of hyperactivity and changed the name instead to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or what we now know today as ADHD. As you might imagine, psychiatrists were having a field day with this new introduction, and through the 1990s, any child who exhibited behavior outside the neurotypical sphere was typically classified and treated accordingly. If it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's gotta be a duck. The issue, however, is that we were experiencing the same problem we had back in the early 1930s. We still didn't have a concrete answer for the underlying question. How does a child develop ADHD? So to answer that question, we need to look back at the year 2003. Now, this was a huge year for medical research in many ways, but most notably in the fact that 2003 was the year we were able to effectively crack the human genome and map it. Now, for those of you who don't know, the human genome is a list of instructions for how we operate. Think of it like a user's manual. We believe we had finally unlocked one of the most elusive parts of humanity, and most importantly, we finally had an explanation for anything we could not quantify or explain. You see, there's a long-standing argument in the field of medical science that asks a simple question. Is the data I'm looking at based on things that just so happen to relate to one another, or do we have actual proof that these things are causing the issue itself? Now, in the world of science, we call this correlation versus causation. With correlation, we would say something is red, roundish, has a stem, it's sweet, and it's a fruit. Now, for those of you listening, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that sounds like an apple. And for the most part, perhaps you're right. However, I could just as easily be describing a strawberry, a cherry, or a raspberry. You see, the issue with us cracking the human genome is that we use correlation as a way to explain how we operate. And just like we saw in the last example, it's far from concrete. To make the process a little easier to understand, scientists began using percentages as a way to better assess the likeliness that a specific trait is expressed in that particular person. Perhaps you're wondering if your child is going to have, let's say, red hair. For that to happen, there needs to be a mutation in the MC1R gene, marker RS1805008. Now, not only does that mutation need to happen, but it must produce more pheomelanin than eumelanin. So you might be asking yourself, what does red hair and gene mutation have to do with ADHD? Well, I'm glad you asked. What this really means is that there is still no definitive way to know if a mental disorder is due to a genetic trait or if just the possibility that a mental disorder is due to a genetic trait. And yet we still have psychiatrists, psychologists, physicians, and neurologists that utilize these sets of correlative data to explain to patients why they are the way they are, as though it is based in concrete fact, when it's really not. It is, however, based on what we call empirical data. So in simple terms, empirical data means that we have observed it happening in a large number of people under similar conditions with similar outcomes. But that doesn't make it concrete. Some experts even say that this is nothing more than a large-scale effort tainted by confirmation bias. So, the reason that ADHD is so prevalent in our society is due to a variety of factors. First, we have doctors in the field who rely on outdated testing methods and guesswork to diagnose patients. Since there's such a large gap between the information held within different versions of the DSM, and doctors graduate at different times in history, studying medical science under those various releases, there is understandably a difference in the way they would diagnose and treat patients. Second, since there's such a large difference in the way treatment is implemented for different people, coupled with our drive to share these life stories on social media, there's obviously quite a bit of confusion that people are getting regarding information about ADHD. So in simple terms, everyone is playing a game of telephone, only the word you use in the beginning is always changing. And this is really disastrous for the field of mental health. It's like everyone is playing a game of baseball. Some people are using a baseball, some use a basketball, some use a golf ball, and they all play with slightly different rules, but everyone is calling it baseball. So the big question is, how do we address this? How do we actually diagnose patients in a way that is effective and offers them a standardized treatment that actually works no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, without confirmation bias, without using historical tables to draw assumptions? Is that possible? And if so, what would that look like? Well, we know that diagnosing mental disorders strictly on the way people behave does not work. We know that diagnosing mental disorders based on a percentage of a chance that someone's genetic makeup will correlate to the data we've seen in the past really only gives us a ballpark estimate. That doesn't work. The idea is that if we can't observe a patient, we can't give them a proper diagnosis. And fortunately for us here in reality, this method of thinking is categorically false. There is, in fact, a better way to diagnose patients in a way that accurately paints a picture of who they are and how they operate. Here at Real Life Academy, what we've done is we've found a solution that allows psychiatrists, psychologists, and neurologists a way to effectively understand and treat people with ADHD in a way that helps them improve the quality of their lives. No more guesswork, no percentages of a chance due to genetic factors, just accurate, direct data to help your patients move forward toward a solution, a real solution. So, if you or someone you know is experiencing ADHD, share this podcast with them. Perhaps you're already in treatment and you're working with a mental health professional. That's great. We urge you to talk with your doctor. Let them know that there are resources available to help them make the most accurate diagnosis possible. Listen, everyone is capable of change, but like we always say, it has to start with you. Each of you choosing to make a stand and take control over your emotional, physical, and mental well being. As always, and until next time, thanks for listening to the Real Life Podcast. We'll see you on the next episode.